Alright, this is going to be a helpful guide for all you guys that are having difficulty with any and all your images. Hopefully this connects things. Whatever I say hopefully helps, but do not use my words directly or my sentences. I will try to give you guys 2 sentences per vocab word up top so that you can have a variety of items. So needless to say, you guys hopefully all have the foundation with the piston, but 2 links for the piston. I would say the piston connects to the connecting rod in order to transfer the power from the combustion cycle over. And you could also say that the piston has to be in time with the valves so that everything runs properly. And then from the valves we could link to the camshaft. So there's 2 with that. Your serpentine belt, if we look at a different picture, you can see that the serpentine belt, your sentence could be something similar to connects all the accessories and is driven by your crankshaft. Crankshaft gets its power from the camshaft. Another one for a serpentine belt is that you could say that the alternator is driven by the serpentine belt, and if the serpentine belt falls off, the power steering pump and the water pump would no longer work as well. Crankshaft is the foundation of the engine. And let's scroll down. Crankshaft connects to many different things. On one side of the crankshaft is the flywheel, which connects to the starter. On the far side of the crankshaft, we have the timing belt or timing chain, which connects to the camshafts. Your spark plugs are part of your ignition system as well. I would probably, if it were me, link them in with the timing of the system, or we could also link it off of the cam crank sensor. So if I come down to the spark image that you guys have on your sheet, you can either go off of this one or this one. If we go look at the purple one, you can see that we have an ignition control module, and you have, should be on here somewhere, your crankshaft position sensor or camshaft position sensor. So off of your camshaft, we could and should be able to link your ignition system, because that's going to pick up the location, send the information to the controller or ignition module. From the module, it will send it to the coil pack, and from the coil pack, we are going to send it to the spark plug. Another interesting way that you could probably use spark plugs is simply link it through the piston. The piston is driven by the ignition system once the fuel is in there. You can morph your sentences as long as you understand how things work and that there is a relationship. Your camshaft. Camshaft is simply turning your intake and exhaust valves off of your timing chain, opening and closing those valves, which will bring air in from your intake manifold and send it out to your exhaust manifold. Spark plug wires. Hopefully you just saw my sentence and can come up with one somewhat off that, but your spark plug wires link the ignition coil to your spark plug so that we can use the ground in the block to complete the circuit, so that we can combust the flammable fuels in there from your intake. Connecting rod. Connecting rod, of course, connects the piston to the crankshaft and transfers a linear motion up and down into a rotary motion. In addition to, of course, transferring simply the power from the piston. Ignition coil pack is the kind of the transformer of the automotive system. Your coil pack is going to take your voltage once it is coming from the battery and alternator at 12 volts, step it up to around 30 to 40,000 volts, higher if you're on a modern car, and send it to the spark plug so that we can convert an electric potential over into a spark. Timing belt and chain. You can take it a variety of ways. But for the most part, your timing belt links your camshaft and crankshaft and allows the items to run in a synchronized manner. Timing belt, timing chain. Also, many times you can kind of twist this to many of the engines that you work on. And your timing belt also typically is going to run your water pump. or coolant system so that you can't overheat as you're running, since the engine will produce a large amount of heat. And there should be a system in here with your water pump. Yes, which is normally driven off of the timing chain. And of course they're right next to each other. Now note that mine is different than yours. I merged it so that on this quick little video I can do as little scrolling as possible so that you guys can make sense. These are the same exact words that you have, just kind of shifted around. Your water pump, of course, then is also going to be forcing water through the system if the thermostat's open. So the water pump, you can link to the thermostat. Your thermostat is located in the thermostat housing, which we'll get to in a minute. Your rockers, we're jumping around a little bit, but if we come up top and look at your valve train, on a typical older engine where the camshaft is down in the bottom and it's not an overhead cam system, you're going to have your camshaft pushing push rods. Those push rods are going to move rockers, which will then push your valve up and down. On an overhead system, we can also have rockers that are driven in the cylinder head. So there's another place that we could link your camshaft to your cylinder head. It is driving your rockers, which are pushing your push rod or your valves. The modern version of rockers could be the tappets. A tappet is an upside down bucket, whereas your rockers act like a seesaw and simply get pushed up and down, and it transfers that energy. A tappet directly takes the force of that lobe off the camshaft and pushes down on a tappet. So the tappet will take the force from the camshaft turning and open and close valves. And we can link your valves either to your cylinder head, to your piston, or to your block. So one sentence for each of them. Your valves will open and close off of the camshaft, allowing fuel in and exhaust out. Your valves are held in the cylinder block and are in charge of opening and closing the combustion chamber. And then we could also link and simply say the valves allow the manifolds to either bring in fuel or to allow the exhaust out. Your starter solenoid Bendix, hopefully we are aware that we're going to be looking for the flywheel. The flywheel would be mounted on the side of the crankshaft. So when the starter comes over to the crankshaft, it is going to turn the pistons up and down through the small little gear of the Bendix. Your alternator is in, of course, your electrical system. We can either take two different approaches. We can either say that your alternator is in charge of running all your accessories off of your serpentine belt and stick it and keep it simple, give the whole car the power that it needs, or we can link it in with something other than the serpentine belt, and you can talk about how the alternator is in the electrical system and it's in charge of keeping the battery at a full charge. Your air conditioning compressor, really the only way that we can link it in is by saying that these are bolted to the block where the serpentine belt drives it, or we could link it into the electronic system and say that people have control that way, but that would be a far stretch. Power steering pump, pretty much link it off of your serpentine belt again, because if your power steering goes out, one of the things that you might want to check immediately, especially if other lights come on at the same time, is that serpentine belt. Your cylinder head has so many options of talking about it that it's not funny. If we scroll down here, your cylinder head of course is the top of the combustion chamber. I guess I don't have a very clear image of it. However, your cylinder head is here. Your cylinder head is going to be the part that closes up the combustion chamber. It is sandwiched down to the block using a head gasket Your cylinder head also contains the valve train, which opens and closes the valves. Your cylinder head also holds your exhaust manifolds, which are in charge of allowing the air and fuel mixture in that is properly set up, or your exhaust out. And of course, it contains your camshaft as well. Your flywheel, as we spoke of already, is directly bolted onto the crankshaft. Crankshaft turns either when we're running and transfers power to that flywheel so that we can get it to the transmission. We can talk about the flywheel being how the car actually starts with the gears from the solenoid and starter bendix. Or we can simply say the flywheel takes the power from the pistons off the crankshaft, and due to its weight actually causes the power to be smooth because it has a large amount of momentum. Your head bolts, of course, take your cylinder head bolted down to the block with the head gasket in between. Your oil filter is screwed onto your block, allowing the oil to actually filter through, keeping all your parts connected and lubricated. So from the oil filter, you could talk literally about any mechanical piece of how that it needs fresh, uncontaminated oil. Your oxygen sensor, its physical location is normally off of an exhaust manifold, which I do not believe I have on my imagery. But your oxygen sensor normally is mounted on the exhaust manifold, so we can talk about that off of your cylinder head. Or you could talk electrically of how the oxygen sensor is set up so that it is used by the computer along with other sensors, such as the coolant temperature sensor, to actually run the car properly and efficiently. Valve cover is simply there to keep your valve area clear of debris and keep the oil clean. Throttle position sensor. Throttle position sensor itself is always off of your intake. This is my intake manifold. You're going to have a piece that bolts on. Normally before this is going to be your air filter. There is the butterfly valve in here, and as you press the gas pedal, that valve opens and closes. On the same shaft that is connected to your butterfly valve is your throttle position sensor. Throttle position sensor solely tells the car how much of the gas pedal is actually being depressed, kind of more in a percentage way. So if you are at 20% throttle, it will allow 20% fuel to be sprayed in. If you press it more, it will spray more fuel in. Push rods, as we said, looking at an older non-overhead cam system. Push rods push the rockers up and down, allowing the valves to open. Head gasket is going to be sandwiched in between your cylinder head and your block. 3 jobs of your head gasket. Head gaskets allow the combustion chamber to be sealed. Head gaskets allow your oil and coolant to pass through without being spread into the wrong areas. And then, of course, your head gasket also allows dissimilar metals, the head being aluminum and the block being cast iron, to be joined together without having a corrosive reaction. Your intake butterfly, I would have directly relinked up to your throttle position sensor. If you don't, you can come up with a sentence as long as it makes sense. But your intake butterfly valve is connected to your intake system, which allows your air to come in, and then also is hooked up downwind of it from your fuel injection and fuel rail so that we take air and fuel together, which will then go into your intake manifold. So intake butterfly valve is simply allowing or changing the amount of airflow on your intake, which goes in your cylinder head. Your tensioner pulley, going to look at the belt diagram. On our belt routing diagram, we have many idler pulleys and tensioner pulleys. An idler pulley is simply a pulley that is bolted there to allow the belt to stay in a specific position and or change direction of the belt. whereas your tensioner pulley many times will automatically be set to keep proper tension on the serpentine belt itself. So between these two words, I would definitely use them in relationship to the serpentine belt, and you can also use it in relationship to the other accessories. But there is an idler pulley actually on the tensioner arm. Its only job is to move in and out to keep the slack off of that belt. Your intake manifold, I would have it linked to your fuel injection rail, your throttle position sensor, and your butterfly valve. So using those in a sentence, my intake butterfly valve opened, which sent information to the throttle position sensor. You could say my intake manifold allowed the fuel injection system and throttle position sensor to work in a joint mission in order to run properly. Or you can simply give me a sentence that is saying the intake manifold is connected to the cylinder head so that the engine can get fuel. We could link the intake manifold also to your valves. So the intake manifold is set up so that it can allow fuel and air into the intake through the use of valves so the cylinders can actually run. Your exhaust manifold, I would say something along the lines, keeping it simple, linking it to parts directly. Exhaust manifold bolts onto the cylinder head to allow the exhaust valves to get rid of the fumes from the engine block. And those fumes are then analyzed by the oxygen sensor. That would give you multiple ways to connect it. Freeze plugs are a term that I haven't used too much. However, on your block, there are places that when we form the engine that need to be kind of blocked. If you guys want and you're actually watching this video, you can delete out freeze plugs and not use them. Just make sure you tell me that you watch this video. But freeze plugs are really there simply because we have to manufacture a block a certain way. If you don't use coolant properly and an engine does freeze, typically those freeze plugs will actually pop out and leak. Your distributor and rotor obviously are part of your ignition system. So different ways we can relate that to things is in relationship to your camshaft. Since your distributor is turned directly by your camshaft, which would be right here. This would be an old school way where the camshaft and crankshaft would be down below. Your distributor would be driven by a shaft to keep everything in the correct timing order. And then up on the top is your distributor and rotor that actually spin, which will send your spark to your ignition coil and then to your spark plug. Your thermostat housing, and your coolant temperature sensor, I would all put together. So if I come down and look at the coolant system, so if we're looking at the coolant system, starting off with your thermostat. Thermostat is in charge of opening and closing the coolant access to the radiator when the temperature of the block gets too hot. The water pump is constantly driving the water around, and the water pump pushes the water through the thermostat when it is hot. We can say that the thermostat is inside the thermostat housing, which is bolted onto the cylinder head. The thermostat also has the coolant temperature sensor normally very close to it, so that we can tell the computer how warm the engine is so that it knows when to switch over. One of the last items in this line is your weep hole. Of course, your water pump, when it is pushing the coolant around, eventually will wear down, and a item that will let you know that it is failing and that the block may start to lose coolant is the weep hole. which is normally located on the bottom of that water pump. And the only one that I did not touch directly in line is the cam crankshaft position sensor, which can be used for two different items. Your cam crank sensor will be used by your ignition system to let the engine know when it should have spark, or it is also related to when it will spray in fuel. Obviously, we will spray in fuel first, and then on the next stroke after intake, after combustion, we will have your spark. So intake, we'll spray in the fuel using the crank or camshaft position sensor, or the combination of the two. Spray in fuel, compress it, and then because we know the position of it on the second stroke after that, we will ignite it. Hopefully this video helped you guys out a little.